All right, I hope you don't experience whiplash as we switch topics from the fabulous world of drag to the decidedly less fabulous world of Christian nationalism. We're going to have a panel of speakers, and the first speaker this morning is Andrew Seidle, who will be a familiar face for many of you. While his humble beginnings were as a Grand Canyon tour guide, Andrew eventually found his way to FFRF, where he worked as a constitutional attorney and eventually the director of our strategic response team. He now works as the vice president of strategic communications for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Yeah. Let's see, other notable things. Andrew officiated my wedding. Thanks, buddy. And probably more pertinent to today's talk, he has written two incredibly enlightening books on Christian nationalism and the radical redefinition of religious freedom. So the first, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, is for sale in the back there. And the second, also for sale, is American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. So everyone, please buy his books. But first, welcome to the stage, the incomparable Andrew Seidle.
Thank you. It's lovely to be back. To all the Christian nationalists out there in America, we are not coming for your rights, we are coming for your privilege. So, okay, yeah, you can go for that. That's the dedication of the latest book, American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. And religious freedom protects everybody here in this room. It guarantees your right to be blasphemous, godless heathens. To say, why, yes, I am an atheist. To avoid church service in favor of gatherings like this. To take the sage advice that Kate Cohen gave from this stage yesterday. In other words, religious freedom has long been a shield, a hallowed protection against government overreach. The minority's protection from the tyranny of the majority. And it's a right that has been guaranteed by a strong separation of church and state. But not anymore. A well-funded, powerful network of Christian nationalist organizations and judges, I'm talking about $1 billion shadow network here, is working to turn that protection of religious freedom that's supposed to be enjoyed by all of us into a weapon of privilege and supremacy for the few. And thanks to this packed Supreme Court, they are winning case after case. And now, religious freedom is the tool, the weapon of Christian privilege, of Christian supremacy. So this shadow network really is waging a crusade to weaponize religious freedom. And I'm going to keep coming back to that phrase. This is a war of conquest. Right? They're not trying to conquer land, but they are trying to conquer our Constitution and remake it in their image. America was not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. We are not a Christian nation, but they would make us so. And the weapon that they are forging to bring about that constitutional apocalypse is religious freedom. But the question I want to answer first is the why. Like Sauron and the Ring, Voldemort and the Elder Wand, or Thanos and his little gauntlet and the Infinity Stones, they are seeking a weapon of power. But the question is why? Why? Why are they so scared? And it's because of you. Do you know that? Because the nuns are on the rise, because Americans are leaving religion behind, because we elected our first black president, because we have a black female vice president, because of marriage equality. Because every day we are closer to racial and gender and LGBTQ equality. And more specifically, because they are so accustomed to seeing a narrow world that only reflects their straight, white, conservative Christian patriarchy, that the existence, let alone the equality of anybody else, feels like a threat to them. So why the crusade? Why are the Christian nationalists seeking this weapon? It is largely a backlash against equality realized. Conservative white Christian Americans' status as the dominant group in this country is threatened. And it has been for some time, right? They're losing the culture wars, a phrase that I kind of hate because it masks attacks on human rights. Their benighted ideas and ideology are unpopular. They're losing the privilege and the deference which they believe they are due. And when a dominant group or a caste in a society feels threatened or feels left behind by circumstances, it reacts, or it overreacts by seeking a way to retain that status. And that is why you're seeing them turning to Christian nationalism, turning to tearing down democratic norms, to these so-called strongmen, to things like January 6th, and that is why they are seeking this weapon, equality. And studies actually back this up. They show that these Christian nationalists conflate demographic loss with a threat to their freedom, specifically to their religious freedom. That tells us that they fundamentally misunderstand religious liberty as privilege. But we know that equality, even when it means the erosion of a privilege, is not discrimination. We're not actually expanding rights or giving out new rights. We are recognizing rights that have always existed under the law but were never enforced. We are affirming the humanity of our brothers and sisters and siblings and admitting that we've been wrong. So as we realize the values implicit in we the people and equal justice under law and these other founding maxims, as we recognize that human beings are human and worthy of rights, conservative white Christian America is dying a slow demographic death and rebelling. They are raging against the dying of their privilege. And so they declared war. You can feel free. It's not an applause. And the crusade is a quest to find the weapon that will win them this war, a weapon for regaining that once dominant group's status. And again, when I say they are weaponizing religious freedom, that is not a frightful turn of phrase. Right? I mean precisely that. In case after case, they are litigating the legal meaning of religious freedom as a constitutional right, and in the process, redefining it, perverting it, the meaning. The Crusaders' religious freedom challenges are superficially, at best superficially, about Christian crosses and veterans, or playgrounds and skinned knees, or private school vouchers, or bakeries and website designers that just want to exercise their art, and coaches that just want to pray. Yeah, but really, they are about privilege and supremacy, literally about privileging the right kind of conservative Christian over everyone else. And the goal there is to use religious freedom to elevate conservative Christianity above the law. And so I tell the story of this decades-long now campaign to forge this weapon in American Crusade. And I genuinely do not think that you can understand what is happening in this country right now without understanding this fight, this attack. As many of you know, I have lived these cases. This fight has been my whole career. I've litigated some of them. I've briefed others. I've been on the front lines defending our country from this assault. And in American Crusade, I tell you the true stories behind each of the Supreme Court cases that have advanced this campaign. And I promise you that whatever you think you know, and as informed as every one of you are in this room, there is so much more to the tale, and things are so much worse than you realize. The legal media prizes balance over truth. Balance over truth. And they tend to treat all players as genuine and honest and fair-minded, though that's starting to finally crack. And the Crusaders, the groups and the people behind this crusade, are none of those things. So in American Crusade, I didn't do what a lot of pop law books do, which is just repeat the facts as stated by the Supreme Court. Because on these issues, the justices themselves will manipulate the facts and the law to reach a desired outcome. You all laughed at the coach imposing his prayer on students' case. I mean, this is a coach imposing his prayer on other people's children. And the lower court judges warned in that case that the crusader was spinning a, quote, deceitful narrative. A judge wrote that about what the other side was doing in that case, and the Supreme Court rubber stamped it. So in American Crusade, I dug deeper. Right? I interviewed the people that were involved in these cases. I scoured dusty archives. I did everything I could to get to the truth of what actually happened in these cases so that you can learn the truth. Because it's not just the facts, but the law itself can also be manipulated. And I think a lot of times that we legal professionals, we can get buried under legalese and civil procedure and judicial philosophies and levels of scrutiny and precedence. I think sometimes we hide behind them. And often it is better to just shed all of those trappings and get back to the basics, to cut through all of that bullshit that lawyers and judges build up around their profession, the jargon, the case names, and even the legal tests. So I wrote American Crusade so that everybody can understand the threat and just see how radical and dangerous these crusaders and these Supreme Court opinions truly are. Because when you cut through all of that prattle and piffle, a simple truth becomes fairly obvious. The questions presented when religion and the law collide are not that hard. They're not that complicated, and they're actually pretty easy to resolve, especially the cases that have come before this court. Unless, of course, there's some maybe ulterior motive behind those cases. All you have to do is draw 3 basic lines. Okay, now, in the book, I creatively refer to these as lines number 1, lines number 2, and lines number 3. Listen, try to keep up, okay? This is what I mean about shunning jargon, though, okay? So first, we distinguish between belief and action, right? Your right to believe is absolute. Your right to act on that belief is not. So I open the book with several stories about drivers who let Jesus take the wheel. This happens. They are free to believe that Jesus is a backseat driver. But if they act on that belief, the civil law can step in and say no, right? We can fine them, we can take away their license, maybe even send them to prison or maybe some therapy. Belief is unlimited, action is limited. And that brings us to the second line. Okay, if it is limited, then where can the government step in and say no? Where is it appropriate for the government to enter into the equation? And the answer here is also pretty simple. It's where the rights of other people begin. You've all heard that your right to swing your fist ends at the other person's nose. Your right to freely exercise your religion ends where the rights of other people begin. Period, full stop. Religion is not a license to harm others or infringe their rights in any way. And then line number 3 is also pretty easy, and it should be a favorite of everybody here, and that's the separation of church and state. Our government has no religion to exercise, nor may government officials abuse their power to impose their personal religion on other people. Like that public school coach abusing his power to impose his personal religion on other people's children. So with those 3 basic lines, the questions that are posed in these Supreme Court cases that I go over in American Crusade, again, become pretty easy to answer. These 3 basic lines really do get you most of the way. So think about it. Can a limited liability corporation refuse to serve a gay couple in violation of civil rights laws because the owner of that business is a conservative Christian? Can a government official refuse to issue a lawful license because she's born again? Can business owners thwart laws that grant employees health care rights because of what the owner's holy book dictates? Can Christian foster care agencies take public funds and then refuse to serve Jewish foster care families? Can churches flout public health measures and risk the lives and safety of entire communities? Do Christian parents have a right to use the government's taxing power to fund their children's Christian schools? And can they do this even though our taxes already pay for a full system of schools that are open to everyone? And what if those Christian schools are bigoted and discriminatory? Can one narrow religious belief be given the force of law to deny half the population bodily autonomy? You can answer those, yeah. Anybody want to go with yes? No, so we should put all of you on the Supreme Court. These are not hard questions, right? The court got all of those wrong. And this didn't happen overnight. The Crusaders laid the groundwork for this crusade for decades, beginning after Brown versus Board of Education with the rise of the religious right and the moral majority and school vouchers and choosing abortion as the wedge issue to avoid sounding like the racists they were. The Supreme Court issued a call to arms in a 2010 opinion involving a cross in the Mojave Desert. And it really signaled the start of this crusade, the push to warp this legal definition of religious freedom. And the Crusaders, the legal groups that make up this billion-dollar shadow network, groups like Alliance Defending Freedom and the American Center for Law and Justice and First Liberty Institute and Liberty Council, this Orwellian word salad, they heard the call to arms. And then they filed case after case and opened the floodgates. And I detail those in American Crusade. And side note, the judge that our lovely student activists mentioned that denied them in the early stages of their case and also was on mifepristone, trying to strike that down, Matthew Kaczmarek, worked at one of those groups, First Liberty Institute. The Crusaders set the cases up, and then these conservative justices and the Trump judges come and knock them down. And that accelerated after Trump took over. And it really does begin to look a lot like collusion, especially when we find out that the justices are fundraising for these same donors and they're wining and dining on these super yachts and fishing trips. I mean, it really does begin to look like collusion, or a different word for that same thing, corruption. But the conservative justices on this Supreme Court are not impartial jurists carefully working to determine the legal meaning of a constitutional provision without bias. Right? They're not calling balls and strikes. The Crusaders didn't pack the court to put impartial jurists on the bench. They packed it with Crusaders. And Leonard Leo is universally recognized as the guy who orchestrated the hostile takeover of the Supreme Court. And a former employee described Leonard Leo's mission like this, quote, "He figured out 20 years ago that conservatives had lost the culture war. Abortion, gay rights, contraception, conservatives didn't have a chance if public opinion prevailed. So they needed to stack the courts." And that's what they did. And just notice the anti-democratic admission and the goal inherent in that quote. If they don't stack the court, the majority would rule. If they don't stack the court, democracy will work. And this goes back to the why. Why is this happening? The rising equality and the waning supremacy that motivates this crusade. And overall, Leo's group spent $540 million that we know of packing the court from 2014 to 2020. And you simply do not spend that kind of money to get an impartial court. They bought a court. And Leo's job was described as, quote, the monitor of the nominee's ideological purity. Talking about the judicial nominees, the monitor of the nominee's ideological purity. All told, he's responsible for the nomination and confirmation of Roberts, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. Thomas is an old friend. All 6 of them are or were members of the Federalist Society. And that's 6 votes on the Supreme Court that were chosen for their crusader ideology. And this worked. We have stats to show. And the stats I'm about to tell you don't include the 2 most recent terms, which were pretty exciting for Christian nationalists. But under Roberts, one study found before Roberts, religion won about half the time. But after Roberts, that jumps to 81%. And this is not a pro-religion shift, but a pro-Christian shift. Christianity won before Roberts 44% of the time, and then nearly double under Roberts, up to 85% of the time. Religious freedom has become a weapon of Christian privilege. So American Crusade puts a face on those numbers and proves that the new guiding principle of this captured Supreme Court is not the Constitution or the law, but simply this: Christianity wins. And despite that, I have hope. And the wellspring of my hope is this basic definitional truth. Their power-hungry aggression is growing our movement. Their wins in the abortion case, in the 303 creative case, in the coach case, their wins swell our ranks. And remember the why. The whole reason for this crusade in the first place is the shifting demographics. White Christian nationalists are working to privilege the chosen few. Every legislative and legal victory that they notch alienates more people, wakes more people up to the danger, and drives more people away from their movement and into our welcome open arms. They're crusading because we are working to meet the unmet promise in the US Constitution, the simple idea that we the people means all people. And as we continue to march towards that progress, Christian nationalists are fighting ever harder against it. They will not go gently. They will rage against the dying of their privilege. But in the end, we will win, because they fight only for themselves. And where they are selfish, we can be selfless. They want supremacy, we want equality. And that's why in the end, we will triumph. Not because our principle is better than theirs, though it definitely is. But because we have the numbers on our side, and you can't fight math. And let me just temper this real quick, and then I'll be done with a word of caution. There are concrete solutions that I offer in American Crusade, but none of them are quick or easy. The Crusaders played a long game. They captured the highest court in the land, and those justices they are drunk with power. We have to play a long game, and they have to expect a long fight to win and to heal the damage that they are causing. We must shatter the myth that the judicial system is going to fix this for us, that there is some creative silver bullet legal case that we can take that's going to win this. We have to organize and message in ways that build power and that fight to realize the aspirational ideals of freedom, equality, and democracy. That's the work I do every day at Americans United, and that's what American Crusade aims to do. Thank you.
As a reminder for all of you who have questions for Andrew, after our next two speakers, the three will be returning to stage for a Q&A. So to welcome our next speaker, Amit Pal, FFRF's Director of Communications, will come on stage.
Sorry about that. Hopefully it's the only mishap during the day. Thank you, Sam. And let me first say as to how wonderful it was to meet Andrew again this morning after a bit of a gap and see him speak. So let's have another round of applause for Andrew Seidle. I'm here to introduce Professor Samuel Perry. Professor Perry has a PhD from the University of Chicago and is professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma. An award-winning scholar and teacher, Dr. Perry is among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity in American politics, race, sexuality, and families, along with over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles. And I'll get to this particular contribution that Professor Perry made to a landmark report that we did in just a bit. Along with over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles, Dr. Perry is also the author or co-author of 5 books, including the award-winning Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, and The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Treat to American Democracy. His forthcoming book is called Religion for Realists, Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion Now More Than Ever. Professor Perry is also very involved with the popular media, since he is a contributing writer to Time magazine and has written for many news outlets, including the Washington Post, NBC News, and the Dallas Morning News. Professor Perry, and this is what I was referring to, was also a contributor to our report that we co-authored and co-put together with the Baptist Joint Committee on the January 6th insurrection and its ties to Christian nationalism. Both the books, recent books that Dr. Perry has co-authored, are available, and he will be doing a book signing along with Andrew in front at 11:30. So please, both these books, Taking America Back for God and The Flag and the Cross, are available in the back for purchase. So let's give a warm round of applause for Professor Perry.
Hey, thank you. What a privilege. It's such a wonderful opportunity to be here. I'm I'm so thankful for Andy Seidle's work and who will also be following me, and Amanda Tyler. I come at this from a different perspective. I am a social scientist. That is my trade and training, and I believe I contribute something unique to this conversation. I am not an activist or a lawyer. I'm not a pastor or a theologian or an ethicist. I'm somebody who is beholden to data. And that requires me to follow data where it leads. And I've been studying this movement for the last 10 years now with various co-authors and colleagues. And I think that's really important to be able to study these things, to be able to gather national data, to be able to see how to define our terms carefully, to think carefully about how we measure these constructs called Christian nationalism and define what it is we're looking at, and to see how it corresponds to various other political outcomes like attitudes and behaviors and those kinds of things for two reasons. One, I no longer have to convince people that Christian nationalism is a thing. You may be surprised to know, about 3 or 4 years ago, it was a lot of uphill pushing on this idea of Christian nationalism. We were trying to convince people that, hey, this is something that's out there. This is something that is guiding people's political views and behaviors. It's something that is really powerfully influencing the Christian right and motivating what they're doing. And people would say, that's not a thing. That's a fringe thing, or that is something that you made up. We were accused of that oftentimes, of something sociologists just made up to try to suppress conservative Christians from voting or to try to slur. That's obviously not the case. We have books coming out, as I'll talk about in a little bit, where conservative Christians are now calling themselves Christian nationalists by name. Politicians are now campaigning on this name, Christian nationalism. There becomes a risk there. On the one hand, I don't want the term Christian nationalism, as it becomes more popular, it's something that people are talking about. I don't want it to become the left's version of the word woke. Right? You know what I'm talking about, right? Like you've heard the term woke get thrown around, and everything that is right of or that is left of me is woke. I don't like it. It's woke. It's scary. That's woke. That's, and you use it as an adjective and as a noun and all of those kinds of things. I don't want everything that Christians are involved with or that I think is a little bit right of me to just be called Christian nationalism. That's sloppy thinking. I don't think that's the kind of thing that we want to do. We're not into slurs, right? Like, we're not into indiscriminately throwing around labels that have no meaning. They lose their meaning. They lose their power at that point. But on the other end of that, so I don't want to call everything Christian nationalism. I think we have to be careful about defining our constructs, and so I will try to urge us to be that this morning. But I also don't want, and this is where data helps us, I don't want to give the impression that this is a fringe thing. That when you think Christian nationalist, you should think the QAnon shaman with horns screaming in this big picture and praying in the Senate chamber. That might be an example of this, but it is far more pervasive than many people realize. And I think that is something that we try to emphasize in our books with our data as well. So my talk outline today. We're going to define what is white Christian nationalism. How do we talk about this in our most recent book, The Flag and the Cross, and all of our research these days. And we're going to talk about how we measure this and what it means, why it's important. We're also going to look at how does white Christian nationalism threaten democracy. Again, we're going to dive into the data and see how white Christian nationalist ideology corresponds to various anti-democratic, conspiratorial, and authoritarian strategies for taking back power in America, the very things that Andy was talking about a second ago. And lastly, we're going to consider some pathways forward. Political science is not rocket science, right? What I mean by that, people are sometimes very difficult to predict. The behavior, we can't make laws about people will always behave in this way when they're given opportunities, but they're not so unpredictable. Right? Given certain constraints, given certain realities like demographic shift that Andy talked about a second ago, we actually are pretty good at knowing when the options are limited what's going to happen in the future. And I want to talk about what's going to happen in the future and how we respond to that. So first, defining our terms. What is white Christian nationalism? What do we mean by that? We could think of white Christian nationalism as at least three things. And I don't mean to say that to be evasive. I believe we can talk about white Christian nationalism in three different registers. And I think this is important to be able to distinguish between these three. First, white Christian nationalism is a political ideology that shapes attitudes and behaviors. The way we try to get at this in our book, The Flag and the Cross, is we develop various kinds of measures. Now, measures are evolving. We use what we might call psychometric tests to be able to try to capture how Americans are embracing this ideology and responding to that. And so in The Flag and the Cross, we have since updated a lot of these questions, and we ask different questions that we feel like are a little bit more fine-tuned now. But in The Flag and the Cross, we ask a series of questions. We ask Americans how much they agree or disagree with the following statements. We are, in our book, trying to capture both what we call the deep story of white Christian nationalism. That is the mythological narrative that America has this special relationship with God, and it is holy, and we're married together, and this is something that should always be. Look at the first two questions, or look at go down to the bottom two questions in that list. The success of the United States is part of God's plan, that there's some kind of a special relationship that we have. I consider the founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, to be divinely inspired. Right? Somebody who would agree strongly with those statements would say, I think we have a special relationship, that God likes us best, that America is where God pays attention. And by implication, we ought to keep it so. The other 5 questions have to do with what we call the vision of Christian nationalism. That is the political goals. Look at the top one. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That's pretty explicit. You would think if somebody strongly agrees with that statement, they're who we would consider a Christian nationalist. But look at what follows. The federal government should declare or should advocate Christian values, should enforce a strict separation of church and state. We look at people who disagree with that statement because they don't want a separation of church and state. Should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces, prayer in public schools, those kinds of things. These are culture war kinds of questions. And so what we do is we look at Americans, how much they agree or disagree with these statements, and we add them up together and we create a scale so that people who score lower on this scale are people who largely reject Christian nationalist ideology, and people all the way up to the people who score the highest are the people who largely affirm it. Now, I think it's important to be able to talk about this ideology not as a clinical category. You either are or aren't a Christian nationalist. I actually don't like going around calling people Christian nationalists. It's something I avoid if I can. It's kind of a conversation stopper. It's like calling somebody a racist or a Nazi, especially as the term has taken on greater popularity and people know what it means now and what it's associated with. I prefer to talk about Christian nationalism as a spectrum, as an ideology that people can really reject wholly, people can be ambiguous about and embrace with varying degrees of uncertainty, or people can be true believers in that ideology. And as I'll show, the more you subscribe to this ideology, the more likely you are to hold certain values and beliefs and behaviors that I think are quite concerning for anybody who values democracy. Why do we call it white Christian nationalism? This past week, I read an article by somebody on the Christian right who is actually an advocate for Christian nationalism. And he pointed out that within the past couple of years, we had started calling it white Christian nationalism. And he accused us of saying, you know what, you did that because it made it sound more scary. Right? Like you wanted to make Christian nationalists sound racist, and so you just threw this label on there without any kind of empirical justification. That is wholly not the case. White Christian, now we call it white Christian nationalism. We try to nuance that statement now because the way Americans answer our questions, remember what we just did a second ago, what I just showed you? Oh, excuse me. These questions, notice they have nothing to do with race at all. Right? Like everything has to do with religion. It's about religious values and religious heritage, Christian nation, all those kinds of things. Nothing having to do with race. And yet, we find that white Americans in particular, when they read these questions, they interpret these questions in fundamentally different ways than people of color do, especially African Americans, but also including Latino Americans as well. When white Americans read these statements, it seems to evoke the idea of nostalgia, of threat, of wanting to go back to an earlier time when the right values and the right people were in charge. When African Americans read those same statements, it doesn't seem to evoke the idea of going back to an earlier time when the right people were in charge or the right values held sway. They seem to have in mind something more aspirational. Martin Luther King Jr. would occasionally reference a Christian nation. Frederick Douglass would occasionally reference a Christian nation. When those guys are referencing Christian nation, it is holding America to account for the values they never lived up to. Right, is you claim to have these values, but this is nothing like a Christian nation as I understand it. And I think that is how African Americans in particular and Hispanic Americans as well seem to interpret these kinds of questions. And I'll just show you an example of this, how divergent these responses can be. Okay, so this is just one example. I've got slides and slides of examples like this. It works this way on almost everything that we ask about. But this is just the percentage of Americans, and by the way, we have statistically controlled for various outcomes here. We have controlled for, say, people's political ideology, ideological ideology, region of the country, education, all those kinds of things. So what we're doing is we're isolating the effect of one thing, Christian nationalist ideology, on how people feel about this one issue. The percentage of white and black Americans who agree the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. All right? So that seems like a controversial kind of statement. Notice that as white Americans increase in their adherence to Christian nationalist ideology, what we see is a linear trend, right? Every time you increase in Christian, the more likely you are agree to this, the more likely you are to say, yes, the way we control violence in this country, the way we control gun violence is by giving good guys more guns. Notice African Americans don't really change much. right? Like it doesn't seem to affect their views or values in this kinds of way. And again, it works this way across a variety of outcomes. This is why we call it white Christian nationalism. It seems to operate in a powerfully different way as white Americans seem to conflate religious supremacy and identity with their own racial and ethnic supremacy and identity. The two things are conflated. As I speak right now, in fact, and I wasn't able to attend this talk, there is a talk on the other side of the square in Madison. There's a group of social psychologists who are meeting for a national convention. I'm on a team of those social psychologists, and we've put together experimental research that tries to tap into this idea of how race and religion correspond to one another, how politicians can leverage that. Right now, they're presenting research that we've collected, experimental research, where we asked, we basically gave a group of white Christians various kinds of narratives or stories. We exposed them to treatments as we talk about in experimental research. And we wanted to see what happens when we tell them that Christians are being persecuted. Christians are under attack, and politicians say Christians are under attack. And what we found is whenever we told a group of white Christians that Christians are under attack, it makes them feel that white people are under attack. It doesn't work that way for any other group, but for some reason, if you just tell a group of white Christians that Christians are under attack, they feel like white people are under attack. Think about how strategic that would be, right? If I were a savvy politician and I knew how that worked, if I knew that I couldn't say, I couldn't say overtly racist things, but I did want these people to feel like there was this sense of ethnic and racial threat, I could just say, wow, Christians are under assault. Christians are under attack, our Christian values are under attack, and I can evoke that. I can make them feel like I can trigger that in a group of people, and that is exactly what we see happening. So Christian nationalism is not only a political ideology that shapes values and behavior, it is an emerging political identity. It is something that people are starting to embrace. This is mentions of Christian nationalism in 2022. On Twitter. Sorry, so this is data scrape. We can't do this anymore since Elon Musk took over. Sadly, he blocks that kind of data scraping ability. But we see Christian nationalism jump off the charts. What's going on in June and July? Sadly, it wasn't the publication of my own book in 2022 that caused that kind of buzz. Mine came out in April, didn't make much of a dent there in Twitter discussion. But what that is Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie Taylor Greene recorded a video of herself saying that the Republican Party ought to be the party of Christian nationalists, and she campaigned on it. She sold shirts with it. And if there was any doubt what Marjorie Taylor Greene means by Christian nationalism, she shows you with the dukes up, right? It's combative, it's a fight, right? It's not about loving your neighbor and self-sacrifice. It's about fighting the left or those kinds of things. And people are campaigning on this, but not just this. Within the same year, this month, last year, in fact, there were two books that came out, and they sell rather well. These are two books written by, I feel, pretty unsavory Christian leaders arguing for Christian nationalism by name. One is Andrew Torba, the founder of the free speech platform Gab, who is a noted troll and anti-Semite. On the left is Stephen Wolfe, who has said publicly that interethnic marriage is sin because God wants ethnic groups separate, and that we ought to revoke the 19th Amendment. This is the kind of people who are writing these things. It's actually kind of a gift that they are putting these things out, that it's like, oh, this is actually what we've been talking about, and you guys are advocating for it. We asked Americans this time last year how well the term Christian nationalism described them. Do I think these people knew what Christian nationalism means? No, not really. We didn't define it for them, but we just wanted to see whether or not they would respond to the term. We found that about 25% of Americans said the term Christian nationalist described them very or somewhat well. 45% of Republicans said that, and over 58% of evangelicals, white evangelicals, said that. And again, I don't think these people knew exactly what they were talking about. All right, they hadn't necessarily heard that, but it is rather concerning that people would hear the term Christian nationalism, and over 58% of white evangelicals would say, yes, sounds like something I'd be interested in, right? Like that's, as this takes on a life of its own, as the label continues to be owned by certain groups who say, yes, this is a good and Christian and important thing for us to embrace overtly, it becomes something that takes on an even more influential position in politics and identity. So lastly, Christian nationalism is not just an ideology, it's not just an identity, but it is a political strategy that aims to activate the ideology and identity. This is a guy named Kerry Hughes, a scholar, communications scholar. He looked at all of the communications, presidential communications going all the way back from FDR to Trump. And he looked at how many times words like God words and faith terms, right? Either specific Christian allusions or very generic references to religion, how often they were used. Now, since going back to FDR, you see there's not a lot of There is not a lot of variance in terms of like bipartisan, like both parties use it. I'll just give you an example. Look at Obama and Reagan. In the number of faith terms and God terms that they use in their speeches, like their public addresses. Watch what happens when I include Trump here, right? Almost doubling Reagan and Obama, which were already quite high in the kind of use. But it is the kind of rhetoric that he's using, and it is evoking the very things that I am describing. This idea that we are a Christian nation and that this needs to be taken back, and I will be defending that for you. Let me just give you some examples. This is, we are going to protect Christianity. No other president, right? Like even Bush, who is an overtly evangelical president, all of his religious rhetoric is filled with these generic, really civil religion kind of illusions, right? Like almost dog whistly and not overt in the way that Trump does it. We're going to protect Christianity. Look at Christianity. It's different places. Christianity is under siege. Other religions, they're banding together. And they're using it. Somehow we have got to unify. Our country has to do that, unify around Christianity. So avert Christian nationalism. This is what we need to do as a country. A society without religion, this is right before the election. A society without religion cannot prosper. A nation without faith cannot endure because justice, goodness, and peace cannot prevail without the glory of Almighty God. I have no idea what that means, right? Like I don't know. That is a word salad, as Andy was talking about a second ago. But this is something that he started to lean on his speechwriters a little bit more. But look at what he says next. As we speak, every Democratic candidate is trying to punish religious believers and silence our churches and our pastors. And our opponents want to shut out God from the public square so that they can impose their extreme anti-religious and socialist agenda on America. My administration will restore faith as the foundation of American life. Lastly, this is a group of, you probably are familiar with this picture. I want to unpack this a little bit, but you notice on the left a bunch of quotes about Christianity being under siege and us being the ones who are going to stop it and protect it. The promises that he makes as a defender of Christianity, as a defender of Christian privilege. But notice what's going on, and this references the experimental design that I talked to you about earlier, about these social psychologists that we're doing this experiment with. When did this happen? George Floyd protests. Right? At the height of George Floyd protests, June of 2020, you remember? He goes in front of St. John's Church. He has Lafayette Square cleared, goes in front of St. John's Church, and he silently holds aloft the Bible, doesn't open it up. Somebody says, "Is that your Bible?" And he says, "It's a Bible," right? Like he holds it up, doesn't say anything from it. What is he doing at that moment? Well, he's communicating religious solidarity. These are the principles I stand for. These are the group that I stand for. But at a time where his followers, his base, what's going on is, what they're told at least, is racial riots. What it's also communicating is ethnic solidarity. It's racial leadership. This is white Christian nationalism. He's not saying I stand with the prophetic black church or the Latino Catholics. He's talking about Anglo-Protestants, white evangelicals who are his base. I am your advocate. I am the one who will protect you from this, not religious, but racial violence that is coming after you. So why is white Christian nationalism here? I've got to land the plane a little bit. How does white Christian nationalism threaten democracy? We talk about this at length in our book, The Flag and the Cross, but I just want to give you some examples. So this is as white Christian nationalism increases, and I don't have time to read off all of these things for you, but as white Christian nationalism increases, we're looking at white Americans. White Americans are increasing in a linear fashion more likely to say, stop bad guys with guns, with good guys we need to use the death penalty more, that we support the use of torture, that police should be able to use any means necessary to maintain law and order. So this is authoritarian violence. It is anti-democratic. Look at this one over here, the one that is going down. You see that line that's going down? We asked Americans whether voting is a right or a privilege. Just pick one. Is voting a right or a privilege? Now, you would be pleased to know that most Americans, the vast majority, say that voting is a right, not a privilege. But as you increase in your adherence to Christian nationalist ideology, in a linear fashion, you are more likely to say, no, voting is not a right, it is a privilege. In other words, it is not something that shall not be infringed, it is a privilege that we can constrain or that we can take away. Christian nationalism is also anti-democratic profoundly. Christian nationalism is also highly correlated with conspiratorial beliefs. Look at the gray one right there. This is the QAnon conspiracy. It's the one at the bottom, so it's not a ton of people, but you see there's a linear relationship between embracing Christian nationalism and believing that there is an elite cabal made up of economic leaders of business and politics who have a child sex trafficking ring and a pizzeria. It's one of these things that you ask about on a survey and you're like, this is the most ridiculous question I've ever asked on a survey. Surely nobody will affirm that they agree with this. And yet we find the more people subscribe to Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to do so. Lastly, these are two things related to the QAnon conspiracy, but look at that relationship that we see. the more white Americans subscribe to Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to say that there is a storm coming soon that will sweep away elites in power and restore leaders. And because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save our country. So what I'm trying to demonstrate in this is that Christian nationalist ideology is an ideology, it is an identity, and is a political strategy aimed to activate this, and it is moving towards an approach to politics that is anti-democratic, conspiratorial, and really supportive, if not warm towards, if not very supportive of authoritarian violence to be able to take things back. Now, considering pathways forward, and here I just want to wrap this up briefly. Statistically speaking, Christian nationalism is not increasing percentage-wise in the population. There is an increase in people who embrace that term, that label. But in terms of people who hold those views, secularization, as Andy was talking about, demographically really is growing, and it is offsetting a lot of the gains that Christian nationalists wish to build. But what does that mean? What happens when a group of people recognize demographically that their days are limited and that that they have fewer opportunities to be able to win free and fair elections? Well, it's not hard to predict, right? Like, what would you do? Well, there's only few options. What you have is you can just hold your ground and die off and never win another election, which they don't want to do. You can change your platform and try to gather in more people and say, like, hey, people don't like what we're selling, so we've got to change and we've got to open this up. After the Republicans lost in 2012, there were calls to do that, and they said, no, we just need to be able to appeal to the base with anger and fear, and so that is the other option. If you don't want to die off, if you don't want to change, what you have to do is you have to distract. You have to distract with scapegoats. You have to say, look at the Muslims, look at the immigrants, look at the LGBT persons, look at the secular individuals, look at the woke, look at the socialists, look at the left, trying to take what is ours, and what you try to do is you try to get white working class individuals to try to vote against their own economic interests and do it by distracting them, by saying, hey, it's not the business people that are it's not the rich, it's not the people that we're protecting with all of these tax breaks, it's those outsiders, right? The cultural outsiders who are trying to cut in line and take what is yours, and that is what is going on. And if you don't want to do that, and maybe you want to respond in another way, something else you can do is what Andy talked about, is you can try to make sure that democracy can't hurt you anymore by securing lifetime appointments. And you can try to subvert the vote. Does this sound familiar? Does any of that sound familiar to you? So just in short, what we need to do is we need to make sure that this is an unsuccessful political strategy going forward. We need to make sure that this is not something that wins at the ballot box. 2022 was a good year for that, but it needs to be better in 2024, obviously. We need to defend democratic access and to ensure majorities who oppose Christian nationalism, and they really do, can choose representatives. And lastly, we need to defend democratic norms to ensure elected officials who are sympathetic to white Christian nationalism and beholden to the base cannot subvert democracy through the courts. Thank you so much for your time.
Awesome. And there will be time for more thoughts during the Q&A after our next speaker. So next, please welcome to the microphone the chair of FFRF's Executive Council, Professor Emeritus Stephen Hurdle, who will introduce our next speaker and honoree.
Morning. Our next speaker on Christian nationalism will be receiving FFRF's Champion of the First Amendment Award. Amanda Tyler is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, known as the BJC, which upholds the historic Baptist principles of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion, and protecting the establishment by the government. She's the lead organizer of BJC's Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign and co-host of BJC's Respecting Religion podcast. Amanda worked closely with FFRF to produce last year's report on Christian nationalism at the January 6th insurrection. She also testified last year before Congress about ways in which Christian nationalism provides cover for white supremacy. Religion News Service has named Tyler one of 2022's Rising Stars in Religion, a member of the Texas and U.S. Supreme Court Bar. Tyler has experience working in Congress, in a private legal practice, serving as a law clerk for a federal judge. Tyler began volunteering in the BJC office as a Georgetown undergrad because she cherished the Baptist principles of religious liberty and the separation of church and state. Tyler was named executive director of BJC in 2016 and lives in Dallas with her husband and their son. We at FFRF have been tremendously impressed with our religious allies, including Sam Perry, who we just heard. Later today, we'll be hearing from PRI's Robert P. Jones and, of course, Amanda Taylor, who has the prescience to found Christians Against Christian Nationalism back in 2019. Please welcome FFRF's champion of the First Amendment, Amanda Taylor, who will be receiving an award.
Well, thank you so much. It is really a profound honor to receive this award from FFRF today. And it has been a joy to work with FFRF on so many of our shared values when it comes to keeping the institutions of church and state separate, because that is truly the best and only way to protect religious freedom for all people. I want to provide, before I speak about Christian nationalism and our campaign, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, just a very brief update about who BJC is, because you might be hearing about us for the first time today. And so my slides, I do have all of our social channels and ways that you can follow the work of BJC and the work of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. BJC is an 87-year-old advocacy and education organization headquartered on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to advocate for everyone's faith freedom. We are the only denominationally based organization that is solely focused on religious freedom and the separation of church and state. We file briefs at the U.S. Supreme Court. We advocate in Congress, and we talk about our advocacy, as was mentioned, on a podcast that I co-host called Respecting Religion. I want to talk a little bit about why is it that Baptists care so much about the separation of church and state? That might be a surprise to some of you, but we at BJC are heirs to people like Roger Williams, who was the founder of the First Baptist Church in America, and whose efforts to oppose state-sponsored religion in the Massachusetts Bay Colony ended in his banishment and eventually in his founding of Rhode Island as a haven for religious freedom. In many ways, Roger Williams was himself a victim of Christian nationalism. But it is both Black and white Baptists who have stood up for the principles of separation of church and state and religious freedom. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a powerful and prophetic advocate for racial justice and economic justice, but also for religious freedom. He said that the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but the conscience of the state. And really, Dr. King was speaking to this healthiest relationship between religion and government, and that is the institutional separation of church and state. That is, of course, the arrangement that is protected by the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment and many state constitutional and statutory provisions. And this arrangement is good for our pluralistic society. It speaks to this fundamental constitutional truth that one's belonging in American society should never depend on what we believe or how we worship or how we identify, whether it's religious identification or not. But this separation of church and state is also good for religious institutions. It gives religious institutions the necessary freedom to follow the dictates of their religion in ways that don't impose on the rights and freedoms of others without unnecessary government involvement. But opposing this long and deep legal tradition of separation of church and state has been an equally long and deeply seated political ideology of Christian nationalism. And I believe that the single biggest threat to religious freedom for all today is Christian nationalism. 4 years ago, our advocacy for religious freedom caused BJC, along with a group of other ecumenical Christians, to form something called the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. This work was born out of a realization that Christian nationalism was becoming increasingly violent and was killing people, particularly in houses of worship. And so we gathered around an interfaith table and said, we need to do something about Christian nationalism. And it was our interfaith colleagues that said, we absolutely agree with you, but we think that you Christians need to be the ones who are speaking most loudly and most forcefully against Christian nationalism. That's because for one, Christians can speak with the most authenticity about how Christian nationalism is at odds with an understanding of the teachings and life of Jesus. And it's also because it is the people who are not Christians who find it most unsafe to live in our society. That our interfaith colleagues said, we simply do not feel safe calling out Christian nationalism with the kind of force that it needs to be called out. And so one of our main goals at Christians Against Christian Nationalism for the last 4 years has been to answer this question: what is Christian nationalism and how can we recognize it? We are inspired by the words of James Baldwin, who said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced. And so if we are going to dismantle Christian nationalism, we first need to understand what it is. And so I am just presenting to you all today a very similar presentation to what I present in churches across the country. I always start with definitions. And I think it's important that we ground conversations of Christian nationalism within a larger frame of religious nationalism. That is a fusion of national and religious identities and goals. It's a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. But with that as a frame, understanding how we are in a larger arc of history and a larger context, global context, we zero in on what is Christian nationalism in the American context. And so this is the definition that we use. I have QR codes on the screen that point to christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org that has many other resources. So we define Christian nationalism as a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. You'll note that this is a very expansive definition of Christian nationalism. It suggests that to be a true American, one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian that holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with conservative political positions. It also suggests that God loves the United States over other countries. And so for Christians, this contradicts the gospel, John's gospel, that God so loved the world, not that God so loved the United States. But Christian nationalism tells a story, relies heavily on this myth of the founding of the United States as a Christian nation, this myth that includes God's providential hand guiding America through history and endorsing all that has been done, all the good and all the evil that has been done throughout the course of our history as being done by God's will. We also define white Christian nationalism. saying that Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And as Dr. Perry said, this is because it allows this coded language that is still filled with white supremacy and racism, but less explicit than more explicit examples of racist language. We can look to our not-so-distant history and the KKK as an example of Christian nationalism from the past, with its toxic mix of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and violence. Christian nationalism operates a lot like racism. It's pervasive. It touches every aspect of our culture. And that Christian nation myth, of course, if it were imbuing God's favor on the history of the United States, then that means we also say that slavery and racial violence and segregation were also endorsed by God. This is the kind of racism that we're also seeing in our schools today that are rejecting attempts to teach about racism and slavery, that they would much rather teach a Christian nation mythology than a more candid assessment of U.S. history. In defining Christian nationalism, we also need to distinguish it from Christianity. For Christians, Christian nationalism is idolatrous because it merges the political and state authority, which causes us to confuse the two. It is also a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus, who was always on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed, who was himself a victim of state power, a victim of capital punishment, put to death by the state. Christian nationalism takes the central message of Christianity, which is a gospel of love, and turns it into a false idol of power. The Christian in Christian nationalism is much more about ethno-national identity than it is about theology or religion. And it carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. But of course, Christian nationalism uses the language and the symbols of Christianity, and so to the casual observer, it looks like the same thing. And we have to acknowledge that because Christian nationalism has been so much a part of the culture in our country for centuries, that American Christianity has been impacted by Christian nationalism, and it can be difficult to tell the difference between the two. And so one of the central callings of the Christians Against Christian National campaign is to ask Christians to examine their own theologies, their own worship practices, and to understand how Christian nationalism is leading them away from following Jesus. We also distinguish Christian nationalism from patriotism. Definitions are important. I define patriotism here as a love of country, which can be expressed in many different ways. Symbolic ways, like waving the American flag or saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and demonstrable ways, like exercising our First Amendment rights, protesting, choosing not to say the Pledge of Allegiance, voting and helping other people to vote. These are all ways to have a healthy sense of patriotism. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that demands allegiance over all other allegiances. And so I tell Christian audiences, if your patriotism is causing you to sacrifice your religious convictions, it is no longer patriotism. It has veered into the unhealthy territory of nationalism. We also need to learn how to recognize where Christian nationalism is showing up. And as referenced earlier, BJC was proud to partner with FFRF to co-produce the report on January 6th and Christian nationalism, which is to date the most comprehensive accounting of how Christian nationalism both inspired and worked to intensify the attack on the Capitol. And it is really vital that this report was made public and was provided to the January 6th Select Committee. And of course, we are deeply disappointed that the report itself was not included in the final report from that committee. But because it is public, it is out there for all Americans to help understand how Christian nationalism both inspired that attack, and so we can learn from it to help prevent further attacks on U.S. democracy. But we would be incomplete if we didn't understand how Christian nationalism is showing up in other areas, including in churches. And so I challenge Christian audiences to think about how Christian nationalism is showing up in their worship spaces themselves. Many American churches have an American flag in the sanctuary, often right up on the altar. And so I ask Christian audiences to question, why is that symbol so important in your worship space? What signal is it sending? Are we here to worship God, or are we here to worship the United States? And to challenge those congregations to have those discussions within their congregations. Because before we can be powerful advocates against Christian nationalism in the public square, it's important that we grapple with how Christian nationalism is impacting us in our religious spaces as well. We are also seeing a large resurgence of Christian nationalism in our public schools. And there are so many different examples of this. We're seeing it in the teaching of Christian nation mythology in place of a more honest account of U.S. history. We're seeing it whenever we see the words Judeo-Christian values being espoused in public schools, in the posting of In God We Trust, or as Texas is trying to do in the posting of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms, in bills that would encourage the teaching of the Bible as an elective course, in Don't Say Gay bills, in book bans, and in my now state of Texas, in the passage of a first of its kind of law that encourages public schools to replace their school counselors with school chaplains. I want to say a little bit about that bill or that law now in particular. You might know, I know it's already been a conversation when it comes to litigation, but you might know that the group behind that law is an organization called Mission Generation. And that group has stated as its goal to work through public education to win, disciple, and send pre-K to 12th grade youth. The ministry goal is to have 100 million people in discipleship by 2025 by offering the school chaplain program in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. This group has succeeded in the state of Texas passing this law, but the way that the law was passed, it does not immediately go into effect. It leaves it up to school boards to vote on whether or not they will have a school chaplain program. Which leads me to the next phase of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism project. We believe that the only way to really scale our project is to go local. And so we have started a pilot project, a local organizing project in North Texas to help bring together both Christian communities, but also to build a large and diverse network of people who are committed to opposing Christian nationalism in their place, in their locality. And so part of our work to oppose the implementation of the school chaplain law in Texas has been to work with chaplains, licensed chaplains in Texas, who came together and wrote a letter to say that they do not support the school chaplain law. We had 100 school chaplains, We had our early signers of this letter, 100 chaplains from various faith traditions and from various contexts who wrote this letter opposing the school chaplain law. We released it to the media. That letter was in 30 different media outlets across the state of Texas. So the first time that most Texans learned about this law was they heard that chaplains don't want school chaplains. We are setting the tone, and so now that school boards are starting to vote, the vast majority of school boards that have voted no, we do not want a school chaplain law in our school board. And so our work at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is really to help bring people of faith together to show what it means to have responsible faith-based advocacy. One of our principles at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage responsibly in the public square. We have far too many examples of people who say they are motivated by their faith behaving badly in the public square. A very extreme example of that was on January 6, 2021, which is the photo on the right. But we are trying to bring people together to have a different kind of witness in the public square, to say they are motivated by their faith, but they are not insisting that their faith be reflected in law and policy. We have an opportunity to do something different, to help legislators tell the difference between faith-based advocacy and Christian nationalism. This is a way for us to support equality, religious freedom, and American democracy, and to say no to theocratic authoritarianism. Thank you.
All right, so we do have time for a brief Q&A with our esteemed panelists. As we begin, some ground rules. If you have a question, you may line up behind the microphone in the center aisle, or you can raise your hand and our stage manager will find you. Please have a short question ready. No long speeches. I really need everyone to hear this. Telling a story and then following it up with, what do you think about that, is not a question. So once you've asked your short question, you can return to your seat while the panelists answer. You can direct your question to a specific panelist, but each one will have 1 to 2 minutes to respond if they so choose. And with that, our first question.
Thank you. Mohammed Sise, Treasurer of Clergy Project. In the light of the fact that church have historically generated income and wealth through strategic community building and service provision, how can those opposing religion institutions offer similar service to prevent the continuation and the dominance and the influence of church? I say this simply to ask, when is FFRF or TCP going to offer maybe a mental health services or daycare services beside our commonly, gathering here to bash out religion?
Well, I can take a little bit of a stab at that. I remember there was a gathering in DC of secular activists that the Secular Coalition was hosting. This was 2013 or 2014. And there was a room full of staff there, and we were just kind of chatting, and one of the people asked, what's the best thing that we could do to support people in this movement and staff? And immediately 4 people said, daycare, childcare. We need to be in that space providing that, because churches are doing it for free. And there are cases that have come up like this, the Trinity Lutheran case that I talk about in American Crusade, where we have the government essentially funding the building of a playground at a children's ministry. We're seeing this more and more where the government is being forced to fund through the weaponization of religious liberty, churches providing these services, and often providing them in a discriminatory way, or in a way that's meant to convert other folks. So I mean, I think it's certainly something that the secular movement needs to consider, and it goes to some of what I think Kate Cohn was speaking about yesterday. Without having some of these other pieces in place that can influence people to make decisions that are not, there are a lot of other pressures that are not related to whether or not something is true, that convince people to either stay in a church or leave a church or go to a different church. And if we don't think about those other things and we just think about arguments, we're not going to ever convince some people. There's just never going to be a full realization of the power of this community that we could see if we focused on some of those community-based things. I think that answers your question. I hope. I'm not positive.
I like all your comments, but there are two words you used that I don't like. And I'm not just blaming you, because it's all of FFRF that does it. And those are the words separation of church and state, because that excludes synagogues and mosques. I would rather you all use separation of religion and government instead.
I think that's a really important point, and I think it's an example of Christian privilege in our society that we use church as shorthand for any kind of religious institution. And so I think that it is a wonderful suggestion to talk about the separation of the institutions of religion and government.
I will add, I think that the biggest threat does come from Christian nationalism, which tends to congregate in churches. Not obviously all of them, but I do think there are times to be ecumenical, but there are also times to recognize where the threat is actually coming from. But it is a point well taken, Herb.
Since we missed the boat to get into churches everywhere with free thought, what organization is now doing the strategic planning to lead? Because the far right has a 5, 10, 15, 20, 50-year plan. Where's ours?
For the secular movement as a whole, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I do talk about in American Crusade, and that I think I know BJC is trying to do this, is we have to play a long game. I mean, we really, really do. I mean, if an organization is not planning for winning this fight 5, 10, 15, 20, 40 years down the road, they're not doing their job, and they're not spending your donations well. I mean, there is massive damage being done right now, and these require long-term solutions. Again, there's no quick fix to any of this, and I have so many people that come up to me with these, and I get sent videos all the time of these people who have these wild, crazy, interesting ideas about a lawsuit that they could bring that will go to the Supreme Court, and then it will change everything. And first of all, the court's not going to let that happen. And second of all, that's not how we're going to win this. I mean, it's building power. It's the hard work of organizing locally on the ground in North Texas, because that's a hotbed of Christian nationalism. That is how we are going to do it. And I certainly know BJC is doing that. That's a lot of the work that I'm doing at Americans United. I know the attorneys at FFRF are constantly thinking about that.
And I would just say that we are all working very closely together, that we are representative of a much larger ecosystem of groups who have identified Christian nationalism as an urgent threat to democracy. And so this is, I think, a moment of, I think really almost unparalleled cooperation between a lot of these groups. And but we have to understand that it is both a long game, and it is absolutely urgent with the threats to democracy and the attacks on voting and voter access and the threat of violence, which is very real.
Yeah, I'm kind of geeking out right now because I got to work with these two on that report on Christian nationalism, and it's the first time we've actually gotten to hang out in person. We kicked it off during the pandemic, so it's nice to be with everybody in person.
Thank all three of you for excellent speeches. The founding myth just knocked it out of the park. It was excellent. American Crusade was even better. It knocked it out of the zip code. While I was reading it, I thought of that Christopher Hitchens would like American Crusade, except Christopher Hitchens is dead. Recently, there have been advances in science for cancer, and I'll get to my question. What will be the subject of your third book?
I'm still riding the American Crusade wave right now. I'm not sure what the third book will be. I appreciate the kind words. I would encourage everybody to go buy the books in the back, because they don't tell you this, but Dan and Annie Laurie make them carry the books back to the office, uphill both ways in the snow if they don't sell out. And Sam's got a bunch of books back there too, so you're doing the staff a favor, really.
Yeah. Anyone else want to answer about their next book? I would love to hear, or
Sure. I invite me back next year, because next fall I will be releasing a book called How to End Christian Nationalism that is particularly, anyone can read it, but it is really going to be geared toward a Christian audience to try to engage a larger group of Christians to join the work that we're doing together.
So my next book really is about the long game of the religious right. It's called Religion for Realists: Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion Now More Than Ever. And so what I'm basically doing is I'm talking about all the scientific work about how religion actually works. It's rooted in identity, rooted in population demographics, rooted in social structures that allow religious privilege to flourish in certain populations. And what I argue is that oftentimes the best students of the scientific research on religion and how it works are the members of the right. They already know about fertility regimes, and they are trying to promote those. They already know about demographics. They already know about social structures and how to leverage the power of the state to be able to ensure Christian privilege. I think going back to the question that we had right before this about different strategies and institutions that will fight this. Demography doesn't solve this problem alone. I know Andy mentioned that, and demography is on the side of say, secularization. This is happening gradually, especially as younger cohorts replace older cohorts. But that is not going to mean a whole lot when a group of people knows that already and is already very active in subverting that process, making sure that they cannot be hurt by demographic changes. That's the whole ball game, is to make sure that we don't have to secure electoral majorities in the future if we know that we can change laws, if we know that we can suppress votes, if we know that we can do all these kinds of things. And so that book will be trying to unpack for people what is that long game and how do we see that coming.
Regarding SCOTUS and everything, I was wondering if you would be willing to venture a guess, educate a guess, if the work of ProPublica and Sheldon Whitehouse on ethics or lack of could be could break the armor that they seem to have around them, so we can start, culling through that Supreme Court and getting rid of some of those folks, or at least get something going. Do you think there's a chance for this?
Well, I don't think we're getting rid of any of the justices. I don't think that's happening. The only way to do that is impeachment. And if you look at the political capital the Republicans were willing to spend to put people on the court, the idea that they would ever impeach and vote to remove a justice, I think that's not realistic. There are solutions. Expanding the Supreme Court is a pretty viable solution. What we need is the political will to make that happen, and that requires us, the people, telling our politicians what we want. And for me, this is, as a voter in the upcoming election, one of the things that I am really wanting to know from every candidate out there is, where do you stand on a binding ethics code for the Supreme Court that has teeth? Where do you stand on expanding the Supreme Court? And not just because we need to expand the Supreme Court if we ever have a hope of any policy solution for things like abortion rights and LGBTQ rights and solving the climate crisis, but also because you shouldn't be able to spend $500 million and buy a court.
Among the steps that you might outline that are needed to diminish or destroy Christian nationalism, could you talk for a minute about the role of voter turnout and what you think that people like us can do towards that maybe we haven't already thought about?
So I'll talk about that briefly. I think we have been tremendously benefited within the past couple of years by young voters and young women in particular. You guys are well aware. So that was actually a huge explanation for why Christian nationalists and election deniers didn't have such a great Tuesday in 2022, because young single women came out and they were responding largely to the fall of Roe. I think Beg your pardon? And their boyfriends. Well, so their boyfriends went for Republicans, unfortunately, or their young single men went for Republicans more than they went Democrats, sadly. But what we see though is we do see a response to I think the situation on the ground. Like you do see as we raise awareness about this, about these issues, about where this comes from, about what is behind these strategies that we see on the right, and what is behind Trump's popularity and Trump's surrogates and various people who are following him, and what game are they trying to play? I think there's potential for people waking up to this and for us being able to mobilize young voters, especially in ways that we haven't before. I have hope, and I do want to say this. Pew Research, and we've been collecting data on this as well, as Christian nationalism is becoming something that is more within the American popular consciousness that we're actually talking about, and thank you to these guys as well for aiding in that. We all of these polling groups, there's a PRI with Robbie Jones, who's going to be talking about today. Pew has been collecting data. We've been collecting data. So we're asking questions, and we're asking Americans, what do you know about Christian nationalism now? And the vast majority of Americans who have heard about this thing think badly of it, right? That warms my heart, right? Like that is good news that they don't say, yes, that sounds like something I want to sign up for. They know it sounds something that is anti-democratic, scary, harmful, anti-Christian, and or unchristian. And so I think the more that we can, with fairness, accuracy, cooperating with one another, and across and building coalitions, I think we can raise awareness in ways that I think can really mobilize voters, and that is necessary in 2024. I know we all talk about like the next election is the most important election in history. But this one is a pretty important election, so I want to see that happen as well.
Amanda, do you want to say anything on that? Voter turnout. Okay, I wanted to make sure we don't have any seated questions. Is anyone raising their hand? I don't see that microphone, so.
There are 3 official expressions in America that link government and religion. In God we trust, so help me God, and under God. Does this concern you? And is anything being said or done or communicated about it?
I'll take that one. I wrote the founding myth precisely to talk about those. The last part is called argument by idiom. I mean, those are integral phrases to the Christian nationalist identity. And that is an identity that's based on this commonwealth of lies and myths. And so one of the things I really wanted to do in the founding myth was combat that disinformation and give you the truth about it. And the truth, like, so help me God, is not in the Constitution. There's an oath. The presidential oath is written in the Constitution. It doesn't include those words. Likely was not added until 1881 by Chester A. Arthur for the first time, who, if you'll remember, was taking over for a president that was assassinated. None of those are from the founding era. In fact, the first law that Congress ever passed was an oath. And a draft of the oath had "so help me God" at the end of it, and they removed that language before they passed their first law, taking it out of the oath. So a lot of this disinformation really feeds the Christian nationalist identity, and I tried to take that on in my first book, The Founding Myth, which I'm also told is back there for sale.
Hi there, this is a question for Andrew, and I am curious as to exactly what steps would have to be taken to enlarge the Supreme Court, and is that simply legislation that would be passed by Congress? And I think you just said that you thought that would be fairly simple, but I'm wondering, don't we need 60 votes in the Senate to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the theory is simple, yes. Expanding the Supreme Court requires just Congress to do something, but the theory of that is very different than the practice. Especially given that there's no Speaker of the House. I mean, Congress is basically deadlocked right now. I mean, yeah, you have to deal with the filibuster and things like that too. So again, that all goes to voter turnout. And yes, but in theory, expanding the Supreme Court, changing the number of justices on the Supreme Court, just requires an act of Congress. But it's that part.
Nothing to add. All right, next.
I would like to be the first recipient of FFRF's future Shortest Question Award. And that is, will your speeches be on YouTube?
Yeah, yes, they will. All right. All right. Yes, was there, all right, next? Yeah, they will be on YouTube. All the speeches will be.
This is a question for Andrew. I know under the Constitution, we all know that certain statuses are protected.
Can you speak up, get a little closer to the mic there?
Race, religion, et cetera, are clearly protected under the Constitution. Federal statutes seem to be eroding with respect to the court decisions as to other classifications that are protected by statute. In the aftermath of the Colorado cake designer decision, I know the target of the discrimination was a hypothetical LGBTQ potential customer. Can you speculate on what would be the legal kind of fallout or consequence if someone engaged in business chose to, by way of signage, for example, suggest that they, based on their own personal religious beliefs, did not choose to provide services to Christians, for example?
Yeah, so I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Amanda. I mean, so what you saw in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case and in the 303 Creative case was an argument made that both free speech and the freedom of religion trump other people's civil rights. And the court bought that argument in the 303 Creative case. So the question is there a limiting principle that doesn't allow it to expand to other protected characteristics or classes, right? That was discrimination against a hypothetical LGBTQ couple. What about race? What about religion? Where does the court draw the line? And I do not see any reasoning anywhere in their opinion or in the argument where there is a limiting principle. And if you go back and listen to the oral argument, particularly in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, but also 303 Creative, one of the questions that the lawyers and the justices were struggling with was basically, isn't this going to allow discrimination on the basis of race? And I talk about this a lot in American Crusade, and the answer to that is yes. There's no way to say that discrimination here is okay in this instance, but not in this instance. And that is coming. Those cases are coming for sure. And in fact, there was right after the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, there was a place in Mississippi, a wedding venue, that said denied a racial couple the ability to get married at that venue, refused to serve them because they said that their biblical identity doesn't allow them to serve interracial couples. So those cases are coming, and the Supreme Court is definitely going to have to struggle with that.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that is the very reason that BJC filed a brief on behalf of the state of Colorado in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case because of the lack of a limiting principle that would expand to all different kinds of discrimination, including, as you note, on discrimination on the basis of religion. And what is particularly awful about the 303 Creative case is it was completely hypothetical, so there were no facts developed, and so there was no way to even divine a limiting principle from the case. And talk a lot about this on Respecting Religion with my co-host Holly Holman about our interpretation of this as well.
All right, this will be our last question, unfortunately.
Hi, Professor. I'm an operations research analyst, so data is my business. You showed current data. Is there modeling or anything going on that shows demographic shifts based on Christian nationalism with the older population, the upcoming nuns, et cetera, that just shows, time series or anything with where it's going or how it might be in the future?
Yes. Oh, thank you for asking that. I just get to nerd out on these kinds of things. So, yes, there is. Briefly, let me just explain how culture often changes. So culture can change in a couple of different ways. Culture can change. Oftentimes, we can have what we call a period effect, which is like everybody's attitudes changing at the same time across cohorts. Older generations, younger generations, they're all changing at the same. One example of that would be support for gay marriage. If you look at support for gay marriage over the last few decades, across all cohorts, older people, younger people are just increasing in their support for gay marriage. Oftentimes, though, that's not the way culture changes. Oftentimes, it changes by cohort replacement, as certain older cohorts stay exactly the same and younger cohorts change rapidly. That is how religion in the United States is changing, largely the story of secularization in the United States, and it's largely the story of, support for homosexuality generally. So if you ask Americans since the 70s, the silent generation and the boomers, their attitudes towards homosexuality has not changed a lot. And most of them are still affiliated and religiously affiliated. It's staying about the same. What we're seeing, though, with every passing generation, you've got boomers, then Gen Xers, then millennials, then Gen Z folks, that line starts to change and angle a little bit more over time to where you have a different world, not because people's attitudes have changed, but because the younger generations are so far different from the older generations. Now, with Christian nationalism, we actually have similar data over time that reflects cohort changes. So when we ask Americans since the 1970s all the way to today, prayer in public schools, do you support the Supreme Court taking out prayer in public schools is a good example. Across older generations, they still want prayer in public schools. They have not changed. Silent generation, even boomers, are pretty much the same. But Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, all the way at the bottom. And so what is going on and what is, I think, is encouraging, that with younger generations of Americans, they don't buy the Christian nationalism thing. There is a lot of effort. I mean, I think what we're seeing in Texas schools, we're seeing certainly in Oklahoma schools as well. I think we're competing with Texas for like #1 in this area. So what they're trying to do, they know that, right? Like they know this younger generation is the key. Like we've got to somehow wed this idea that America is a Christian nation, that you are a Christian, this is something that we ought to fight and make sure that like we take our country back. So it starts with younger generations, but yes, so we do see this is a story of cultural change, not by everybody's values changing at the same time, but as younger generations who are more secular and more resistant to this idea of Christian nationalism taking the place of the older generation. So excellent question. I swear I didn't see that one, but that was a great one, didn't I?
All right, with that, our panelists, everyone. Thank you.